Things have somehow gotten much worse in the Middle East, with US troops being killed in an attack on their base in Jordan. We've also learned some very shocking information that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is planning on firing his commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces, Valerii Zaluzhnyi. So we're going to talk about that as well. In fact, we're going to talk about these stories and several more in this edition of the International Affairs News Roundup. On to the first story. Last week, I asked a question, are we on the brink of a war? And unfortunately, we're actually getting closer to one. In that video, I discussed how Iran and several other countries are not afraid of American power and in fact see it as waning, and that's emboldening them to launch attacks via proxies on US forces. On January 28th, a drone strike targeted US forces in a base in Jordan called Tower 22. This base is located right across the Syrian border. The attack resulted in the deaths of 3 US service members, as well as over 30 being injured. President Biden and other US officials attributed the attack to IRGC-backed forces, specifically Kataib Hezbollah, which is located in Syria and Iraq. President Biden also vowed to respond to these attacks at a time and place of his choosing, but at least at the time of this recording, we haven't seen that yet. But we're going to talk about that here in a moment. This drone strike is part of a larger series of hostilities that we've seen against US forces since the war between Israel and Palestine kicked off on October 7th. Over 160 attacks have occurred against US forces across Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. Iran-backed groups are primarily responsible for these attacks, especially a group like Kataib Hezbollah. And at least up to this point, the worst that we've seen is injuries to US service members, and this marks the first time that US troops have actually been killed in one of these attacks. So how exactly was this attack even allowed to happen in the first place? I mean, shouldn't there be base defense capabilities that prevent a drone from just flying in? Well, yes, and it appears that this was actually an issue of deconfliction, meaning that there was apparently a US drone that was returning from a mission, and both US and Jordanian air defense assets, they both mistook the Kataib Hezbollah drone for the US drone. Basically, it just followed the US drone back to base. And being that it is a drone and that this whole situation happened, it has me wondering how this will adjust the US position on electronic warfare for its forces in the Middle East, as well as how deconfliction will be handled. After all, if all the enemy has to do is just follow American drones back to base to successfully bypass air defense, that's a huge problem. And I understand that deconfliction is hard and there's a lot that really goes into it, but at the same time, it is a critical function of defense. We've seen the US respond to attacks against US personnel in the past, however, it really hasn't been all that significant. It appears that this time will be much different. Reporting out of the White House and the Pentagon have shown that really the plan appears to be a tiered response that could last several weeks, which gives me the impression that this is truly going to be a different experience. They're not really going to be looking after, just a tit-for-tat response. This is going to be a full-on retaliatory strike package that will last some amount of time to attempt to deter Iran and other IRGC groups from doing an attack like this again. Shortly after the attack, Kataib Hezbollah attempted to release a message saying that they had basically paused operations across Iraq and Syria and that they were going to basically be on hold for a while. And following that message, another group stated that they were also going to be pausing operations. And there have been other reports that these groups have been attempting to evacuate their positions in Iraq and Syria. With already a few days passing between the attack on Tower 22 and whenever the US does its retaliatory strikes, you have to wonder if they will even be catching any of the fighters that were responsible for the attack anyway, or if those fighters will have retreated into Iran, where it appears we're not going to be attacking. All of this has really added fuel to the fire of the discussion about the US response to these attacks across the Middle East. And for that, I want to kind of discuss this concept called the escalation ladder for anybody not familiar. This is basically a theory where at the bottom of the ladder, you have the lowest level of escalation, so you could consider that just peacetime. And at the top of the ladder, you have total war. And the higher you climb, the more you implement more dramatic and deadly effects, and that basically takes you closer and closer to a total war. You might hear a term escalate to de-escalate, and that's kind of referring to this theory where you're taking the enemy a rung higher than where they're really willing to go, and that really convinces them to back down. Well, in this case, up to this point, Iranian forces have kind of dictated the height on this ladder that we've gone. For every strike against U.S. forces, the U.S. has really responded with a reciprocatory strike, meaning that they've really responded on an equal rung of the strike. But at no point has the U.S. attempted to take them a rung higher up the escalation ladder. And the reason for that is because the U.S. doesn't want to be responsible for unnecessary escalation in the region, especially considering it's already volatile enough. However, at the same time, groups like Kataib Hezbollah and Hamas and Hezbollah and some of these other axes of resistance groups like the Houthis, they all kind of thrive in this environment where they're able to stay just several rungs below active conflict, but they're still able to get punches in. And so refusing to take them higher up the escalation ladder has really shown that the U.S. is willing to stay on those rungs. And as long as the U.S. is willing to stay on those rungs, those groups will continue to launch their attacks. And that's led to the debate that this decision to refuse to escalate in the region has actually put U.S. troops in danger by not really deterring enemy forces from continuing their attacks. For instance, we've seen several months of the U.S. attempting to not escalate tensions, but at the same time, U.S. forces have been attacked increasingly more heavily since the war kicked off, up to this attack on Tower 22. On the flip side of this debate, you have the argument that the U.S. should take them several rungs higher than they're willing to go and really show that the U.S. is willing to aggressively pursue even Iran proper to get Iran to reel in the axis of resistance groups as well. Simply put, Iran can't really hang with the U.S. the higher up the ladder we go. Very few, if anybody, can. But especially a group like the Houthis or Kataib Hezbollah, they're not going to follow the U.S. up that ladder because they just don't have the capability. So that takes us to this upcoming U.S. retaliatory strike package and whether it's really going to truly take us higher up the escalation ladder and if that will be effective in basically pushing adversary groups down the ladder as a consequence. Whether or not it works and whether or not it's the right decision, only time can really tell. This is all complicated, and it's not like this is all like a video game or, just like a political science textbook. Like, this is real life, and real people are impacted by these decisions. And I know that it's easy to say on a YouTube video, from the comfort of my home that, we should go in any certain direction. That's why I try to be very careful about not saying where we should go. After all, at the very end of the day, actual human people are impacted by these decisions. And in the middle of all of this, and they don't really receive a lot of press, unfortunately, are tens of millions of civilians that have been caught in this kind of crossfire for decades now. And at the end of these decisions, there are consequences, and those consequences will last for years. So having talked about all of this, I want to hear your thoughts. So let me know down in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation going. Now, this isn't the only place in the Middle East where we could see this conflict erupt into a larger regional war. In fact, Israel has been preparing for a potential conflict with Hezbollah. And we've talked a little bit about this up to this point, but there are some details that we haven't been able to discuss yet, which includes the IDF launching basically a battalion-level live-fire exercise near the border of Lebanon. This has also followed an intensified air campaign on Lebanon by the IDF. And that air campaign has actually begun to strike targets all across southern Lebanon. This all, of course, follows a bombing in Beirut, which killed a very high-level Hamas official. However, Israel has not accepted responsibility for that attack. However, several Hezbollah officials have been killed in the Israeli airstrike campaign. All of this includes reports that the Israelis are calling for Hezbollah to push back to the Litani River, and that if they are unwilling to do so via negotiations and diplomacy, then the IDF will be willing to do so with force. And while the IDF has been preparing for this conflict for some time, also consider that Hezbollah has too. In fact, they've been preparing since around 2006. And while there have been diplomatic efforts to mediate this conflict and prevent an expansion of this war, especially with negotiations between Israeli and Hezbollah officials by way of the United States, the UAE, and Egypt, there's really a long way to go to achieve any kind of lasting peace with this. Now, if Israel were to launch a new front against Hezbollah, this would almost certainly take us into a larger regional conflict, because now Israel is attacking into Lebanon and they're pushing a larger adversary group, particularly Hezbollah, backwards. And Hezbollah is a huge group. We've already talked about them, in fact. They receive way more support from the IRGC than Hamas does. And their involvement in the war would likely draw in other axes of resistance groups, up to and including groups like Kataib Hezbollah. And we've already talked about all of this in prior videos, so we're not going to rehash it again. I just wanted to talk about those updates. Now, with the war in Israel going on, there's still the war going on in Ukraine, and we've learned some information that we need to talk about because it's been interesting. There is some drama going on in Kiev, and we need to talk about this drama because it is going to have a high-level impact on the war in Ukraine. Rumors have been swirling that President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has already decided to fire his commander-in-chief Valerii Zaluzhnyi. Now, this all started with rumors and a press release that Zaluzhnyi had already been fired. And following that, there was a press release from the Ministry of Defense saying that those reports were not true. The denial of those reports was also sent out by the president's office. However, at the same time, there were other government sources that were saying that it was pretty much a done deal. So what the heck is going on? According to an article by Foreign Times, and we're going to talk about this article specifically and its author because that also kind of adds some complexity to this story. But let's first start by talking about what the article said and just kind of get an idea on what exactly is being reported here. According to the article, Zelenskyy offered Zaluzhnyi a different position, reportedly some ambassadorship to a very important country, but Zaluzhnyi denied that role. Included with that offer was basically an offer by Zelenskyy for Zaluzhnyi to submit a letter of resignation. Replacing Zaluzhnyi was reportedly going to be any number of candidates, including the head of the Ukrainian military intelligence, Kirill Budanov. And while the report says that Zelenskyy may have already made up his mind, it also states that Zelenskyy might actually not execute on this decision for some time, especially considering the amount of backlash and outcry that Zelenskyy received following the reporting. So why would Zelenskyy fire Zaluzhnyi? I mean, Zaluzhnyi is considered a hero and he has a very strong amount of support amongst the military and civilian populace. Well, the reported tension has actually grown since the war began, for reasons up to and including Zelenskyy's paranoia that Zaluzhnyi might have political ambition and his political popularity. There have also been differences in opinion regarding how to prosecute the war. And those tensions actually got inflamed during the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive. Following the counteroffensive, Zaluzhnyi reported that the war had basically entered a stalemate, and Zelenskyy immediately rebutted and asked him to retract that statement. The reason stalemate is such a bad word basically for Zelenskyy is because that might concern Western supporters and might deter them from giving military aid to Ukraine, which as long as Ukraine receives aid, stalemate isn't necessarily what we're looking at yet. At least not a sustainable stalemate. So they're basically looking at two different things. Zaluzhnyi is looking at the ground situation right now, and Zelenskyy is looking at the potential for where the war can head in the future. Zelenskyy also wants to be directly involved in the leadership with military affairs, and Zaluzhnyi wants to be in control because, again, he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Zelenskyy has reportedly been anxious about the support levels for Zaluzhnyi within the military, with one Kiev Post article reporting that Ukrainian military support for Zaluzhnyi was total and they considered him unfireable. Now, it's important to note that if these tensions exist and if Zelenskyy decides to fire Zaluzhnyi, that's not unprecedented in wartime. Throughout history, there have been several clashes between civilian and military leadership, leading to the civilian leadership firing the military leadership. For instance, President Lincoln had a series of disputes with General McClellan, who was in charge of the Union Army at the outset of the Civil War. McClellan's reluctance to attack the Confederate Army, as well as his political ambitions, led to a lot of tension, and Lincoln firing McClellan later. During World War II, disagreements between Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Sir Archibald Wavell led to Wavell's dismissal in 1941. Churchill was specifically more dissatisfied with Wavell's performance during the North Africa campaign. Of course, one of the more famous instances came with Harry Truman's disagreements with General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War. Douglas MacArthur wanted to more aggressively attack Chinese troops, while President Truman wanted to avoid basically another world war. And that led to President Truman firing MacArthur during the middle of the conflict. So no, the firing of Zaluzhnyi is hardly unprecedented, especially if you consider where the war is at up to this point. Let's try to remember what happened. I mean, there was a lot of optimism, especially from outside of Ukraine, that the 2023 counteroffensive was going to achieve a massive breakthrough and basically bring about an end to the conflict. Now, that was basically a pretty naive ambition and hope. In fact, on this channel, we tried to kind of dispel that a little bit. But at the same time, that's what people were hoping for. And whenever it basically completely failed, people began to wonder what happened and what went wrong. And unfortunately for Zaluzhnyi, a lot of that blame got placed on him. Now, the report talks about Kirill Budanov replacing Zaluzhnyi. So who is he? Now, Budanov is a significant figure within the Ukrainian military. He's currently serving as the chief of the main military intelligence directorate. and he's been doing so since around August 2020. He started his career with the Ukrainian military in 2007 and has repeatedly fought Russian forces in the Donbass, receiving several wounds in the process. However, since the war began, he has been instrumental in the Ukrainian attack and counterattack on Russian forces. In fact, part of his achievements have included massive prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine since the war began. So I say that there's some added complexity with the article itself, and that's because the author of the article, at least that I've seen, has undergone some criticism on his credibility, with some stating that the author isn't credible and actually spreads Russian disinformation. Now, while that's not something that I necessarily can testify to with this individual, I wanted to at least state that because that was something that I had seen amongst some other very credible sources. But regardless, there's definitely smoke with this story. There's definitely tension between Zelenskyy and Zaluzhnyi, and there have been some other reporting basically indicating that Zelenskyy does either plan to or has decided to fire Zaluzhnyi. That said, there's still a lot of movement with this story, so we're going to circle back if we need to down the road. But I wanted to put this on your radar. Now, it's not all bad news for Ukraine, though. There's some new aid coming to the Ukrainian military, and this has a pretty interesting twist. The U.S. is providing Ukraine with a ground-launched small-diameter bomb, or a GLSDB, which is part of its latest aid package to Ukraine. The GLSDB is basically a precision-guided munition, and it has a rocket attached to it, which allows it a range of around 90 miles. This actually significantly increases Ukraine's strike capabilities and ability to target deep within Russian-controlled territory, especially with a capability like HIMARS. The bomb has GPS guidance, which also grants it precision, something very important in this conflict. This delivery is part of a $2.17 billion aid package going to Ukraine. Now, what's interesting about this is that this bomb is not coming from or being pulled out of U.S. stocks. In fact, the U.S. appears to not even have this in its stockage, meaning that this system may have been tailor-made specifically for Ukraine. So why would the U.S. be making tailor-made systems for Ukraine whenever there are more capable systems that exist in greater quantity and have the infrastructure to back them already in U.S. stockages? Well, the U.S. basically has restrictions on what can and can't be sent to Ukraine and what Ukraine can and cannot do with those systems. For instance, HIMARS has the capability to target deep inside Russia proper. However, the United States don't want to be responsible for giving Ukraine weapon systems that they would use to target Russian cities, the result of which could be unmitigated escalation in the conflict beyond Ukraine. To meet Ukraine in the middle, they provided HIMARS, but modified and only delivered with munitions that could only reach Russian forces inside of Ukraine, and the stipulation that Ukraine can only target Russian forces inside of Ukraine. Now, this hasn't stopped Ukraine from receiving weapon systems that can target much further than HIMARS and much deeper into Russia. And this also hasn't stopped Ukraine from targeting Russia deep into Russia proper. However, if you note the weapon systems that Ukraine has used to target Russia, it's old Soviet systems that they had on hand already. And the weapon systems that target much further than HIMARS that they've received, like Storm Shadow, those they've only really used against Crimea. Custom-made systems like the GLSDB really allow Ukraine precision and deep strike capability that they have, but also could use much more of, especially considering they're being outmatched by Russia in artillery usage. So if they can continue to apply pressure with precision, then that might allow them the ability to keep up with Russia with just targeting forces in general. Now let's take a look at Russia, because things are rough really economically, at least it feels like across the world. The economy is not doing terribly, but we need to talk about the Russian economy and really the effect that sanctions are actually having on the Russian economy. The IMF is projecting a global soft landing, and part of that includes actually 1% growth target for the Russian economy in 2024. Yes, the Russian economy is actually growing despite Western sanctions. This growth is attributed to Russia's financial stimulus and the different domestic policies that they've implemented since the war began to keep the economy going. And while the Russian economy has shown resilience against Western sanctions, there's still concern about their energy clientele, as well as the economic impact that sustaining a war in Ukraine will ultimately have on Russia for years to come. Now, we've discussed the impact on Western sanctions on the Russian economy, and it's interesting to see that despite all of that, it's still going to grow. Now, why is that exactly? Let's talk about what sanctions do and what they don't do. Economic sanctions are tools used by countries or international organizations to apply pressure pressure on a government or an economy, basically to change their policy or actions. And I'll say that again, it is a tool to apply pressure, meaning that it's not going to be a tool that destroys an economy, it's something that applies pressure. Yes, we can all see that the Russian economy is being pressured right now, but we can also clearly see that the Russian economy is continuing to work along just fine. In the case of the Russian economy, which is still very large and robust, we have to remember that there are ways for Russia to bypass economic sanctions, like doing business deals with companies in Turkey or China. And we've also talked last week about secondary sanctions and the risk of basically applying sanctions to those groups that Russia's doing business with outside of Western countries. And that has led to some changes. However, it's really with all of this, it takes a lot of time for these changes to have an effect. And ultimately, it's going to be hard to close all the back doors from sanctions, especially again for a country and an economy as big as Russia's. So while things are going on with Russia, there's something that we need to talk about with China, because China is not going to like what happened in the South China Sea just now. The Philippines and Vietnam have agreed on collaboration on security in the South China Sea, and this could include joint cooperation between their maritime forces and coast guards. For China, this might make it more difficult for them to project power and basically pressure either maritime force or coast guard into basically fleeing different claims in the South China Sea. For instance, the PLA might pull up to the Vietnamese Navy and they find the Philippine Navy right there as well. Now, this is really important because it reduces the need for the United States Navy to be that deterrence factor. If the countries in the South China Sea that are all trying to counter China work together, then they might be able to deter China on their own, or at the very least complicate China's efforts of exerting dominance over the South China Sea. Now, it's been a second since we've talked about the South China Sea, so for those of you unfamiliar with what's going on, let's talk about what's going on in the South China Sea and why it's important. The South China Sea is strategically important because of its economic value. It's a huge economic corridor with trillions of dollars in trade going between China and East Asia to Europe, Africa, and the rest of the world. It may also have abundant natural gas and oil reserves as well as fish. China's basically claimed the entirety of the South China Sea, extending far south of the Chinese mainland. And this is basically overlapped with the claims of other countries throughout the South China Sea that enjoy international recognition of their claims. To back these claims, China has basically constructed artificial reefs all across the South China Sea. So instead of having to deploy aircraft carriers and naval ships to get radar coverage and aircraft coverage across the South China Sea, they basically have islands with all the radar and aircraft that they need. And as a result, we've seen a lot of harassment from the Chinese Navy against countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, which is really what has led to these kinds of cooperation agreements being made. It's also led to a lot of anxiety about the aggressive Chinese military that we're starting to see. In fact, some people have described the South China Sea as being a flashpoint for a new world war. However, again, I don't necessarily think that that's the case. The South China Sea might be like a secondary front in a war over Taiwan. However, I'd be kind of surprised if it is really the only spark that kicks off a war in East Asia. But I say that to say that that's really how people look at the South China Sea. So we'll see what impact ultimately that this agreement has on China and its ability to project power down through the South China Sea. I do think that it is reassuring to see that countries are working together and trying to come up with a solution themselves. So with all that said, we've talked about a lot today. There have been some very interesting stories and very complex stories that we've talked about. So I want to hear your thoughts. So let me know down in the comments down below. Leave a like on this video and I will see you all next time. Later.